There is something deeply unusual happening at the heart of Russian power. For more than 160 consecutive days, stretching back to October of last year, the Kremlin released not a single frame of verified footage showing Vladimir Putin inside any of his 3 known offices. Not at Novo-Ogaryovo, the leafy residence just outside Moscow, not at Bocharov-Ruche in Sochi, and not at the secluded compound on the shores of Lake Valdai, deep in the forests of Russia's Novgorod region. The Kremlin posted no footage or photos from any of those 3 offices for more than 160 days, and when footage finally did appear in mid-March, analysts were still unable to determine which of the locations Putin was actually using. For a leader who has cultivated an image of iron certainty and absolute control, this kind of disappearance is not routine. It is a signal. And understanding what that signal means requires going back to the very architecture of deception that Putin has spent the better part of a decade constructing around himself. This is not a simple story about a paranoid leader hiding from shadows. It is a story about a man who, over the course of this war, has fundamentally transformed the way he governs from a figure of public authority into a ghost operating through proxies, replicas, and elaborate systems of misdirection. And it is a story about what that transformation tells us about the condition of Russia itself, now entering the 5th year of what has become the most catastrophic military miscalculation in modern European history. According to Gleb Karakulov, a 35-year-old former officer in Putin's elite personal security service who defected in October, one of the most significant Kremlin insider defections in years, Putin has constructed 3 nearly identical high-security offices across Russia, each a precise replica of the others, specifically designed so that no observer, foreign or domestic, could determine which of the 3 locations the Russian president was actually in at any given moment. The rooms are deliberately windowless. The furniture, the desk configuration, the flags, the old-style telephones, all are meticulously matched. Security officials would deliberately dispatch planes and send convoys to locations Putin had never planned to visit, creating false trails for intelligence services. Karakulov recalls knowing Putin was in Sochi while the news showed him chairing a meeting in Novo-Ogaryovo. "I think this is an attempt to confuse foreign intelligence," he said, "and so that there are no assassination attempts." The man who once stood shirtless on horseback for cameras now operates in a self-constructed darkness. The scale of the concealment only deepened as the war in Ukraine escalated. Sistema, an investigative unit that analyzed hundreds of hours of footage, thousands of photographs, and extensive travel records, found that a large number of meetings ostensibly filmed at Novo-Ogaryovo were actually filmed at the Valdai compound or at Bocharov-Ruche, identifiable only through subtle discrepancies. The placement of a door handle, the grain of a wooden tray, the pattern on a necktie. These are not the activities of a confident commander. These are the activities of a man who genuinely fears for his life and who has spent enormous resources preparing for the possibility that his enemies, internal or external, might one day find him. The Valdai compound, where Putin has spent most of his wartime presence, tells its own story. Satellite imagery confirmed the presence of at least 7 Panzer S-1 air defense systems distributed around the heavily guarded compound, part of what the Institute for the Study of War described as a broader strategy to protect high-value targets from Ukrainian drone attacks, which have increasingly penetrated deep into Russian territory. One drone in January of last year reportedly flew directly over the Valdai Palace during an overnight Ukrainian attack. According to Ruslan Pukov, a member of Russia's Ministry of Defense Civilian Advisory Board, this kind of focal air defense coverage is meaningless at scale because it still allows Ukrainian drones to bypass Russian defenses and strike from uncovered directions. The missiles are there, but they cannot cover everything, and Putin knows it. Beneath all of this lies an even more extraordinary infrastructure, one that has been years in construction and that speaks to the depth of Putin's existential anxiety. Leaked blueprints reveal that beneath the massive palace complex on Cape Idokopas along the Black Sea coast, covering approximately 17,691 square meters and equipped with a private theater, a casino, and an underground ice hockey rink. There exists a network of at least 2 major tunnels, each between 40 and 60 meters in length, situated approximately 50 meters below the surface, designed to function as a secure shelter, command center, or emergency escape route in the event of an attack. The construction company hired to build these tunnels was engaged as early as 2010, more than a decade before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, revealing that even during the era of supposed Western Russian rapprochement, Putin was engineering his own personal survival infrastructure. These blast-proof tunnels feature 15-inch thick concrete walls, multiple ventilation shafts capable of withstanding a chemical attack, a freshwater supply, sewage lines, a fire suppression system, fiber optic and power cabling, and an elevator shaft connecting the levels, along with a moving walkway leading to a private Black Sea beach for rapid evacuation. This was not improvisation. This was a man who, even in his years of diplomatic handshakes with U.S. presidents, was preparing for Armageddon. Meanwhile, as Putin moves between shadow and replica, the war he launched is grinding on in ways that defy any clean narrative. In early March 2026, Russian and Ukrainian officials both claimed frontline progress, with Ukraine saying it had pushed Moscow's forces back in certain areas, while Putin told Donald Trump that Russian forces were advancing rather successfully in the Donbass. The reality on the ground is one of attritional horror. Russia launched 137 drones in a single overnight barrage against Ukrainian cities, with Ukrainian forces downing 122 of them. But the remaining strikes killed 4 people in Sloviansk and injured at least 16 others in the center of the city. In Dnipro, 10 people were wounded in a strike that damaged a residential block and a city administrative building. The numbers accumulate with a kind of numbing regularity. Each attack another data point in a war that has now killed and maimed hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. What makes this moment uniquely significant is the diplomatic context in which the fighting continues. 3 rounds of U.S.-mediated negotiations have demonstrated a consistent pattern described by analysts as process without progress. The first round established a trilateral framework but failed to bridge fundamental gaps on territory, ceasefire terms, and security guarantees. The second, in Geneva, was described as difficult and ended abruptly after only hours on the second day, with Kyiv accusing Moscow of deliberately prolonging talks while maintaining maximalist demands. The United States, under President Trump, entered this process with considerable diplomatic energy. The results have been sobering. The central fault line across all 3 rounds remained unchanged. Russia's insistence on territorial concessions versus Ukraine's demand for security guarantees first. The broader diplomatic architecture tells part of the story. In January 2026, 35 nations, including 27 heads of state, gathered in Paris for a summit of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, agreeing to participate in a proposed U.S.-led ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism involving drones, sensors, and satellites, and to establish a U.S.-Ukraine coalition coordination cell in Paris. France and the United Kingdom went further still, committing to establish military hubs inside Ukraine in the event of a peace agreement, a deployment Russia has categorically rejected. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova denounced the proposal as dangerous and destructive, calling the coalition of the willing and the Ukrainian government together a genuine axis of war, and warning that all such units and facilities would be considered legitimate military targets for Russian forces. The language was familiar, the threat was real, and behind it, Putin was still nowhere to be found. According to analysts at the Jamestown Foundation, Western U.S. and Ukrainian officials have claimed that a peace agreement is approximately 90% complete, but the Kremlin's position remains distant from the draft terms reached during talks in Florida in December 2025 and in Paris in January 2026. The remaining 10%, as with all things involving Russia's negotiating posture, is not a rounding error. It is the entire game. Putin has attempted to justify stalling the peace plan while avoiding direct confrontation with Trump by fabricating a Ukrainian drone attack on his personal residence, and by using a recent Ukrainian corruption scandal to try to delegitimize Zelensky's political authority. Ukraine's President Zelensky called the residence strike story a complete fabrication, none of the standard open-source indicators of a genuine deep strike, local reports, geolocated footage, explosion recordings, ever materialized. It was theater, but theater with a purpose, to give Putin a pretext for rejection while maintaining the appearance of victimhood. As analyst Graham Allison has assessed, if fighting continues at its current pace, Russian forces will likely complete their seizure of all of Donbass within a year, a territorial conquest that would represent a strategic humiliation for Ukraine and a dangerous signal to the entire international order about whether conquest is once again acceptable in the 21st century. Ukraine, for its part, entered 2026 with 42% of its military budget dependent on international partners, a structural vulnerability that shapes every decision made in Kyiv. The scale of Russian attacks has intensified to over 1,000 drones and missiles per campaign cycle, while Ukrainians continue to live under constant bombardment. The war's mathematics are brutal and asymmetric, and no diplomatic communique changes them overnight. What then is happening in Moscow? What is the meaning of empty offices, replica rooms, fortified forest compounds, and the systematic erasure of a leader's physical location from the public record? It means something has fundamentally shifted inside the Kremlin's relationship with its own future. Putin has favored the Valdai residents for most of the all-out war on Ukraine, and since at least 2025, the Kremlin has been taking elaborate steps to hide his location, even in his capacity as head of state, a practice that expanded during the COVID-19 pandemic and has only deepened since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. A leader who governs from hiding is not a leader projecting strength. He is a leader who has calculated that the greatest threat to his power now comes not from Ukraine's military nor from NATO's arsenals, but from somewhere far closer, the corridors of his own government, the shadow councils he chairs through screens, the men whose families he can and cannot evacuate in the event of catastrophe. The war was supposed to be over in days. Russian military planners spoke of a 72-hour operation. 3 years, hundreds of thousands of dead, a continent reorganized around the prospect of further Russian aggression, and the man who started it all moves between windowless replica offices, beneath domes of air defense missiles, through tunnels bored into the coastal rock of the Black Sea. He issues statements through spokespersons. He meets with officials in sessions that may have been recorded weeks before. He issues nuclear warnings and then retreats into the machinery of concealment that only the most frightened men build around themselves. The European Council, meeting in March 2026, called on Russia to agree to a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire and urged all countries to immediately cease any assistance to Russia in its war, while condemning in the strongest terms the continued deployment of North Korean military forces fighting alongside Russian troops in Ukraine. The world has watched this war absorb the forces of one state, the soldiers of another, and the diplomatic energy of dozens more. And at its center is a man whose exact location at any given moment is a state secret, not because of protocol, but because of fear. History will eventually have its answer to the question of what Vladimir Putin wanted and what he was willing to destroy to get it. For now, the cameras roll on empty offices, the drones keep flying, the tunnels sit silent and waiting in the dark beneath the Black Sea. And in some heavily fortified compound surrounded by missile batteries and replica rooms and loyal guards whose loyalty he cannot fully trust, a man who remade the map of Europe sits in the shadows and watches the world refuse to simply accept what he has done.